All right, guys. Good evening. It's 7:05, so let's go. We have 25 in the class, so we're still missing 4 or 5 students. But just like Tuesday, they'll probably sign in at the beginning as we go forward the next few minutes. So a couple of things you will have noticed if you've gone to Moodle between last class and now that there's been a couple of grades that I've put on Moodle for you. First grade would have been participation for attending last class, watching the PowerPoint, and watching the film study at Plastic Ocean. So everybody got 10 out of 10 for that, and I indicated that would be what would happen last day. And likewise, for the vast majority of you who did do the film study and sent me your 200 to 300 word report by way of an essay, the way I actually asked for it by way of a Google form, you also received another 10 out of 10. And the reason for that is quite simple. It was an opinion piece. It wasn't anything that had a right or wrong answer to it. It was something that I was just looking for how you felt about what you saw in the film, particularly with respect to things that you found the most interesting and or the most disturbing. Before we go ahead, the best thing to do when you sign in is to mute your microphone unless you want to actually answer a question or I call on you. That means we won't have a lot of ambient noise in the background as we go forward. Okay, and so again, you would have had those 2 marks on your Moodle for last day. The other thing you would have also found on Moodle would have been I recorded the last day's lecture, so that is there for any of you who weren't able to attend, and I know a couple of you couldn't, so you can certainly watch the lecture there. It was about half an hour long. It was obviously very introductory, basically going through what we were going to do in this class. And likewise, and I sent an email out to everybody regarding this, I've also put on Moodle, posted a lecture for tonight dealing with the constitutional responsibilities and framework within which we have the division of powers, essentially between the federal government and the provinces, which is incredibly important in understanding which jurisdiction has authority over what happens with the environment. So that's there as well. It's just over an hour long. A fair number of you have already had a lot of that lecture from me before, if you've had a previous class with me. And those of you who haven't, it's a pretty good overview of the Constitution in Canada and how it works historically and how it works now. All right, so let's go forward then with respect to tonight. What I want to do firstly is review the film study. So I'm going to call on you to give me your opinions. I've highlighted for the most part what most of you have indicated as the thing that you found either the most interesting or the most disturbing. So I'm just going to call on you and ask you to give me 10 or 15 seconds worth of your further opinions on what you thought interested you in the in the film. All right, and it was a good documentary. So I think it was quite interesting, and hopefully you found it to be interesting as well. Most of you clearly did. So I'm going to first call on Mia. All right, so Mia, what you indicated as important to you was that you found that the plastic found in our oceans doesn't just affect the fish and the birds, but it also affects the people who eat the fish. So you just want to say a few words about that. So if Mia should be here, so unmute your microphone and just respond accordingly. Yes, no? All right. I don't have a list of the people who are here, so I'm not sure if Mia's here. Oh, wait a minute. Mia says, okay, so we're going to learn as we go. Something's not working for her. So, okay, so she couldn't unmute her microphone. I get that. Let's try Joy. So Joy Hawking, what you indicated that you thought was important was the reference to the Great Lakes really brought it home and made it personal. So Joy, do you have a few things you can add to that?
Yeah, I found it sort of like, I find a lot of these sort of documentaries, it sort of maybe seems a bit sort of far off. Us in Canada, we don't, you know, we're clean. We sort of do, in theory, I think a lot of the times we think that we're pretty clean. And so to hear a number like that in a place that's so close to where, you know, I'm living currently, it was very interesting and disturbing. I found there to be a interesting cognitive dissonance with both what I found interesting and also disturbing.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Joe. I mean, yeah, absolutely. The fact that they referenced the Great Lakes and we could see it, we could see us in that that picture that they showed the Great Lakes. Kind of brings it home to us. So thanks for that. Sophie, I'm going to ask you. You basically said one of the most disturbing points you thought were that the plastics in the ocean are not just bad for the ocean itself, but also the health of humans. And you particularly mentioned the most vulnerable being babies and children. So do you want to add to that? Oh, I'm sorry. Sophie isn't here tonight. I apologize. She had a family emergency, so no point going there. Georgia, all right, I'll call on you. What you found most disturbing was the high number of microplastics in oceans that are not able to be seen on the surface of the water, but are frequently consumed by animals. And you also indicated it frightens you to think about how toxic the food is that we consume. So, Georgia?
Yeah, just the part where they sort of skimmed the water, the top of the water, but from the boat, it just looked like a beautiful ocean. But when they did that with the mesh net thing, then there was tons of little pieces of plastic that you couldn't just see floating on the ocean, but that's eaten by animals. And yeah, same thing about kind of the food chain and how that makes its way up to humans, and yeah, it can also affect babies and children the most. Yeah, that's scary. I didn't really think about that before.
Yeah, the woman who was the free diver, when she had her children in the documentary, and she was clearly, and she's actually almost in tears at one point, worried about how she could protect her children going forward. So yeah, absolutely. Shivani, I'm not sure how to pronounce that correctly, but Shivani said that the world is merely coming to an end as a result of pollution. Government officials are aware of the catastrophe, but are lackadaisical about the situation.
Yes, with Shavani actually.
Shavani? Okay,
yeah, so for me, the world is merely coming to an end, but we don't really see it. But watching that video, like, I realized a lot of things because I knew plastic was bad, but I didn't know to that extent. So like, it's so funny to see that everything is like a cycle. So the fishes, they eat the plastic, we eat the fishes. So we're basically getting back our own waste in our body. And we don't even know, because I didn't know that until I watched the video. So it's very distasteful, and like, I think that we should come together and do something about the situation, because I mean, for the future generation, there's not going to be any world for them basically if we don't change this, issue that we're facing.
Yeah, it's pretty scary. So, Shavani, you think?
Yeah.
Yeah. Adam, you indicated that the first point that you found disturbing was the incredible amount of plastic particles that exist and float on the top of the ocean. Top of the ocean water. Adam, you want to add to that? I see your letters come up. Okay, he wants me to say it again. No problem. You found that the first point that you found disturbing was the incredible amount of plastic particles that exist and float on top of the ocean.
Yeah, hello?
Yeah, I hear you. Good. Did you want to?
Yeah, it's crazy how, like, you would think most of the plastic you see is what's there, but it's not. It's what you don't see. It's that makes it the worst. Hello?
Yeah, that's fine. Good. All right. Olivia, what you had to say was that what I failed to see, and the disturbing point made in the documentary, is that virtually every piece of plastic produced is still existing on the earth in some form. Just because I throw away or recycle my plastic does not mean it ceases to exist. Do you want to just have a few words about that.
I knew that plastic, took a longer time to decompose than, say, cardboard or something, but it was like I didn't realize that it still existed from even like 60 years ago. I thought it maybe took like a couple decades. I didn't realize that plastic that, my mom maybe used when she was a kid is still somewhere on this earth. And like, I wonder where it goes. And even like all the plastic I use, because honestly, I do use a lot.
Yeah, you know what? I did this before I saw this movie, but I looked around my house, and this is within the last few weeks, just to see how much plastic there is. And you can't. I'm looking at a printer here beside me. It's made out of plastic. I have a clock on the wall that has a plastic around the outside of it and a plastic screen. My speakers for the computer are plastic. My monitor for the computer is plastic. The computer casing itself is plastic. I mean, everything you look at is plastic. And that, when I was your age, that wasn't the case. First off, when you went to grocery stores, everything was in paper bags, not in plastic bags, and you didn't have to pay a nickel for them. But even beyond that, almost all the packaging when I was a kid was glass, right? And so everybody was recycling glass. And that's an easy thing to recycle. It's an easy thing to understand how to do it, and it is truly recyclable. It's not something that, like plastic, is around forever. So just think about it, and this is obviously something we can think about during the entire course, is, things that pollute us, and pollute the environment, how do we address it? How do we regulate it? How do we remediate it? All those kind of things. That's stuff that we're going to talk during the course. But again, things like plastic or something that, as Olivia was saying, in the movie and the documentary said, just does not go away, right? Except for that, and we'll talk about this later, except for that the system they showed that the USS, whatever it was, ship in the ocean had that incredible machine that in fact got rid of its waste with a plasma burner, which was really pretty cool. So there is a technology to address this kind of stuff, but the question is, who has enough initiative to get that technology kind of out there. Okay, William, you indicated that you thought it was tough to watch the documentary due to the sheer volume of numbers portrayed in the film. Do you want to just add to that?
Hello?
Yep.
Yeah, kind of like the marks, and when you're watching, like at the 15-minute mark, you find out that like 19 million pounds of plastic has been produced globally. So I mean, like even during this lecture, another 20 million pounds worth of plastic has been produced. Finding out that 15% of the bird's body mass was plastic inside. Just those numbers throughout the whole thing, you kind of turn a blind eye to it because you live in a small town like we do. We see plastic, but even looking around the room, your keyboard, your mouse, your monitor, parts of your desk, parts of your chairs, they're all made of plastic. And you kind of just don't notice it until you see something like that where, like I said, 15 minutes in, 19 million pounds of plastic is produced. At like an hour in, you find out that 2.9 million pounds of plastic has entered our oceans and stuff like that.
Yeah, great comparison. I mean, that was really a good way for the film to bring that home, because it had every so often during the documentary, it told you how much more plastic was being produced and obviously being dumped in the oceans. Alyssa Thompson, you said it was sad to see that our society does not clearly see what we're doing to the planet. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so watching the movie, I didn't really notice how much plastic I was using, so it really opened my eyes, hopefully to eliminate that, and hopefully that our society opens their eyes to kind of help the ocean with the plastic. And yeah.
Sure. Jade, you said that you thought it was very interesting that the film provides ideas on how to stop the use of plastic in grocery stores and what to do to make changes in stores. Anything else about that? So this is Jade Fresk. Yes, no? Oh, he's having trouble unmuting his mic, so we won't worry about that. Madison, You liked very much how the producers emphasized that the plastic in the ocean is a global issue and not just isolated to one area.
Hello?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. Like for me, like living in Canada, we don't see a lot of it, especially where we're living, like all of the pollution that's there, especially like even on the coast when you see the videos of like more so underdeveloped countries, you see all of the plastic coming in like on their coasts, like the beaches or like wherever like that. You see it coming in, but you don't see all the like the garbage and everything in the water, because like if you have a drone or something fly across, because you see like the pictures of the water and everything, you don't see all the garbage floating on the top, like within that first meter or foot he said in the movie. And like even the layer, there's oil mixed into it, and you don't see it unless you go underneath and you see everything mixed together and see how bad the pollution really is. And it's not just isolated to like the coasts or like that plastic island that's somewhere like in one of the oceans. Like it's all over and it's coming from everywhere and it's staying everywhere because it's not going anywhere else.
Excellent, thank you. Shell, you said that you thought it was very enlightening that there are solutions starting with consumers' purchasing behavior and by making the government more aware that we're not going to tolerate industry forcing products upon consumers.
Sorry, what was the question, sir?
I was just commenting.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I think that the government doesn't do enough to protect our land and the waterways and things like that. Because even if you go up the beaches at Batchewana and you walk down the shoreline, you'll see that the microbeads are already on the shoreline here. It's terrible. I think that, you know, we need to put those like they have in Germany where they refurbish those plastic bottles. I think we should just get rid of plastic bottles altogether, and revert back to glass and paper bags and things like that. But if you walk down the shorelines, like I said, you can see that we're already starting to be affected by plastic little microbeads washing up on the shoreline. People didn't know what they were a couple of years ago.
Yeah, exactly. And along those lines, and probably most of you know this, the current Liberal government, Justin Trudeau's government, has basically put in place legislation that will outlaw single-source plastics, right? So things that you just use once and throw away. So which are bags in stores and particularly straws in restaurants, those kind of things. They will be, and I have to check on when that's going to happen, but they will become not allowable in retail establishments. So that's a really good step towards this kind of thing. So yeah, we'll see when that comes in. Valerie Aliette, one of the most interesting and disturbing points in the film was the 6 containers with a large amount of noodles, a microplastic pellet that had spilled into the waters in Hong Kong during a typhoon. What did you think about that?
Honestly, I don't even watch the news because there's a lot of bad that goes on and I try to keep my kids from it. So I didn't know that it actually happened, and seeing the large amount just in one shipment was, I think, what was most shocking. And the fact that it's still missing a container with 1,000 bags of it, and it's nowhere to be found currently. So at any time it could actually damage any part of the ocean, lakes, wherever it travels to. And we don't have any plan for that, really.
Yeah, that part of the documentary where again those containers broke open, and the millions of microbeads that came up onto the shore. It looked like it was snow, and it looked to me like it would be virtually impossible to clean that up, to any effective degree. Which is obviously destroying the land in addition to the ocean. It was just very, very hard to look at. It was a monumental mess. Whether it's cleaned up by now, I don't know, but it certainly is something that you certainly don't want to see. And clearly, whatever showed up on the shore is very likely only a small amount of, in fact, what ended up in the ocean. So it was hard to see. Kate, you said that another interesting thing that you saw was the alarming fact that the people all around the world were eating plastic as well and absorbing toxins from plastics in the food.
Hello?
Yeah, hi, Kate, go for it.
Okay, hi. Yeah, I just thought it was very alarming that we're eating fish, like we're feeding our animals water, like from like lakes and stuff like that. So I just found it very disturbing that we're eating it and our animals were eating it and our children, or yeah, it was just shocking.
Yeah, I forgot what the stat is in the documentary, but you know, I think it's over 90% of everybody who's over 6 years of age has some plastic in them. Pretty amazing kind of thing, which is
Yeah.
all of us, obviously. So, you know, we're all susceptible to what's going on in a personal kind of way. Sakshi, Begadia, 92.6% of Americans over 6 years old have detectable levels of BPA in their bodies. Do you want to say a few words about that? She here? Are you here? Okay, don't worry about it. That was the same point I was just making, though, right? So, I mean, you know, if it's 92.6% of Americans, it's going to apply the same to us. So it's just a terrible statistic. Katrina, it was saddening to see the quality of life the people in Manila and Tuvalu have due to the unimaginable amount of plastic and garbage that is collected in those areas. Any further thoughts? Katrina Chorney, I think you're here. Yes, no? Okay. Mike Webster, the negative impacts of living very near plastic waste are now well known. However, the people who live in those conditions generally have no other option. And then the techniques I found most intriguing were the plasma torch method developed for use on American naval vessels and the use of recycling and reselling the plastic back to manufacturers. Maybe give us a comment on that first point about those. A lot of people don't have any option with respect to what's happening to them.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
All right. Yeah, so when I was watching the movie, the areas that they were showing of people living either on landfills or very near landfills, where they're walking over trash every day and they're swimming in the water that's just been stewing in that. I mean, those are people that they don't have any option to get out of there, or they're tied there in some way, because like the reporter was saying, the smell there is it's very rancid. I used to work at a marina that handled cabins waste, and we would bring it to the landfill, and even just a small landfill, it stinks. So I can't imagine anyone choosing to live in a place like that.
Yeah, there was that one part where there was a number of houses that were actually built on what they called burrows, where, you know, which was basically after the Second World War, when the Americans were finished with the naval, with the bases, they just left them, and those burrows filled in, and then in fact were used for waste, and then people actually built their houses on them. And then the kids, you see all the young kids walking on the top of the waste, which is pretty much their playground. Pretty amazing, and Michael's quite right, you know, that, you know, they're for most of these people, almost all these people, I'm sure, they really don't have any other options. Where are they going to go? What are they going to be able to, what can they afford to do otherwise? And it truly is nothing. So it becomes a lifestyle for them, which, you know, has got to be something that they get used to, but it's pretty terrible.
Yeah, and especially with the that little island, all that trash has to be poisoning the rest of the available land, which will make it even less viable for people to live there. So they're going to keep suffering more of these negative effects.
Yeah, one of the things that I was really struck with was the woman who was they were using plastic bags as the fuel to light their fires for their food. You know, what they're ingesting, you know, in that smoke is clearly a carcinogen, you know, and cancer causing. So it's just terrible. And they use it because it's a cheap fuel. So there you go. Stacy, Stacy Zach, this documentary has opened my eyes widely to the fact that what is in our Great Lakes water, 80% of these shorelines are polluted with plastic, and what doesn't settle on the shoreline or on the bottom of the lakes makes its way through the canals and river systems and into the Atlantic Ocean. Any other comments? Stacy? Okay. Sarah? Sarah said, most importantly, this is the point that always sticks with you, is the garbage found in the stomachs of the seabirds.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can, Sarah, thank you.
Okay, so I've watched this documentary like 3 times now, and every time I watch it, that's the one that sticks with me the most. The fact that there is 276 pieces of plastic found in a 90-day-old chick, and it just blows my mind to think about like how much plastic is found in the older birds as well. And those are just one, like, and they don't even live in the water where the plastic is, like the fish, and we eat the fish that is in the water with all the plastic. So that part of the movie or the documentary always sticks with me.
Yeah, thank you. Me too. I mean, when they cut open the birds and open their stomachs, and you saw chunks of plastic, actually, like as big as your thumb kind of thing. It was amazing. I mean, for their sharp edges, and no wonder it kills them. I mean, God. I mean, and they said if it was humans, it'd be the equivalent of having, I think they said 1.5 or 2 kilos, which is like 4 or 5 pounds. That's what I use, pounds of plastic in our stomachs. Just imagine that. I mean, how terrible would that be? Okay, Megan, you said that the point in the film that you thought was the most disturbing was when it showed that whale had passed away because it had about 6 square meters of a plastic sheet inside its body.
Hello?
Hi, Megan.
Hi. So yeah, I don't know. I was just kind of blown away that, I mean, I know whales can, of course, consume a lot in one, inhale, but I just found it astonishing that, that plastic sheet at that size was just, there and available for that whale to unfortunately consume, right? Like there's just that magnitude of stuff like floating around, and I don't know, it's kind of just like unpleasant, like to think about.
Oh yeah, I mean, the 6 square meters is like an enormous amount. Even though whales themselves are incredibly large, I mean, swallowing those kind of things when all they really do to eat is just open their mouths and ingest the ocean. Obviously, whatever's in it goes into them. It's pretty astonishing. So, Jin Wan, you said that it is worth noting that some developed countries did not pay special attention to the control of plastic products, but Rwanda, as a developing country, implemented a comprehensive elimination of plastic products, which made people have to consider the implementation of environmental laws and global methods of execution. So did you want to say a few words about Rwanda, for instance?
Yeah, after I watched that documentary, I find some interest on it, and then find some other documentary and news to do more research about it. And I found out that actually most of the plastic garbage that are all produced, most of them are produced by the developed countries. Actually, for those developing countries like Rwanda or some of the developing countries in Eastern Asia, they don't really produce plastic garbages, because for their development, they have to save more money for their economic. Even though the plastic, and I found out another information that the information like the United States is a great example. They have, if you look at their population is only 4% of the global population, but their plastic garbage produce about like 12% of is equal. It's about like 12% of the whole world's plastic garbage. And for their recycling rate is one of the lowest of the developed countries. So maybe what I feel is the United Nations should focus on those developed countries, to let them try to do better on recycling and the control of the plastic garbage produced.
Thank you for that extra research. That's absolutely excellent. Next week, we're talking about international law in the environmental context, and we will be talking about the approach between developed countries, which of course we are, and developing countries, how to balance those things out in the international context. So that's really appropriate. So thank you. Aurette, you indicated that you thought what was most interesting was the amount of plastic that humans consume per day.
Yeah, it's almost like every day go about we use plastic without even thinking about what the other person is doing, and collectively we all adds to that amount of plastic that is now damaging the environment. And we use the plastic without even thinking of how we're going to get rid of it, without thinking about what's going to happen to it once it leaves our household or stuff like that. And then there's an aspect in that film that noted that 8 billion tons of plastic enters the ocean each year. And that's hard to imagine, 8 billion tons of plastic. You know, we have a plastic bag in our hand, it's weightless, but to see combined 8 billion, that's like astonishing. And you try to wrap your head around that and like, what are we doing? So the film forces me to like rethink my approach, like making a concerted effort when going shopping now to take my reusable bags, you know, and I want to be like that guy refusing plastic products, right? But yeah, that was really surprising for me. And I've been thinking about how am I contributing to the problem too? Because in some ways we all are.
Great comparisons, thank you. Tamiwa, you indicated that plastic creates a food chain of death. Tell us more about that. Tamiwa?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so then I discovered on the video that so basically the smaller animals eat the microplastics and then the bigger ones eat the smaller ones. So basically the microplastic in the smaller ones is also in the bigger ones. So that's like the food chain of death, especially when it gets to humans, because humans also, we're like the top of the food chain and we're also gonna consume these animals. So when this plastics gets into us, is like this is a big problem that we have to, and we can stop this problem right now.
Good. Lexine, the documentary revealed to you that when we do not see a whole plastic, that simply means that it is disintegrated into smaller pieces called microplastics.
Yeah, definitely, because we tend to disallute the fact that we're actually contributing to the pollution that is evident in the world today. Because most times when we go to sea, beach, or wherever, we tend to be like, oh, it's so beautiful and everything, because we're not seeing like the plastic bottles floating on the top. But based on the documentary, you can see that the bottles are actually in the center of like the plates and stuff like that, based on the movement and the breaking down and all that thing. So it was very disturbing.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you. And lastly, for the reports I have in front of me, Tyler, you indicated that it was disturbing to learn that each year the amount of plastic being produced exceeds the amount produced in previous years. This represents a lack of effort on behalf of major corporations and companies to minimize the issue. So any last words on that?
Yes, I was just surprised to learn with even the efforts that are being made with by certain institutions to minimize the issue with the access to certain recovery technologies, as they had called it in the film. I'm just surprised to see that the issue is actually still escalating as opposed to de-escalating, and that was just a surprise to me. Just to learn that these statistics and the numbers are still, again, getting worse, and I was just surprised to learn that. And again, just the lack of motivation and movement and effort on behalf of not only companies and institutions, but also the federal government as well, to minimize and decrease or reduce the amount of plastic and chemicals being produced and released, and just the lack of regulations revolving around the issue.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. We're actually going to have a whole class on the regulatory regime in environmental law, and which is, of course, regulations put in place by levels of government to deal with the issue, which, for the most part, affects exactly what Tyler was talking about: corporations and how they operate their businesses, and the regulations they have to follow, and what happens to them when they don't follow them. So we'll certainly cover that off. And is there anybody else that I didn't call on, or anybody who wants to add any further points to this discussion? Because it's been a great discussion, so I really appreciate it, everybody. Anything else? I just give you a little historical point. My youngest daughter, who is now 35, she was the youngest of 5 kids in the family. And she was always, even as a little girl, was an environmentalist. I don't know why that happened, but she was. And I can tell you that she, in her generation, which is a little bit beyond yours, we teased her all the time, always referred to her as a tree hugger, and made fun of her because she was so adamant about the world around her, and she still is. And good for her, because she actually created a career out of that. So we're very proud of her now for doing what she did. But I can tell you that, for all of the years she was growing up, we kind of teased the hell out of her for being such an environmentalist. So that's just a change in times. And as I said to you before, when I was young, it was the environment, and we're going to talk about that later in the lecture this evening when we talk about the evolution of environmental law. When I was very young, it wasn't even on the radar to a great degree. So it just shows you how things have changed over time. Okay, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to share the screen with you for tonight's lecture, which is basic concepts in environmental law. All right, so it's not a very long lecture, and we're going to have a YouTube video in the middle of it. It's a TED Talk. All right, and so these are basic concepts of environmental law. We're going to deal with some definitions and what have you. So tonight, very much like Tuesday night, is still very much an introductory kind of class, setting the stage for basically the rest of the semester. So all I'm going to give to you this evening, are basically some context within which environmental law takes place, both with respect to definitions and principles that are important. And, again, as I mentioned earlier, the lecture on the constitutional framework that I've recorded and posted on Moodle is there to give you the very broad legal environment in which laws are enacted, clearly important for the purposes of protecting the environment. Okay, so basically basic concepts. The first thing we have to talk about is, what is the environment? The environment is a contextual term. It's not something that is necessarily objective when people talk about the environment. And when we talk about the environment, we have to understand what it means from legal perspectives. And in order to protect the environment, we have to know, obviously, what we're talking about. So various jurisdictions have different approaches to it, and how they deal with the environment. I'm talking about different provinces or different countries. How they deal with the environment may or may not necessarily correspond with how professional, scientific, or what popular understandings of the term the environment actually is. All right, so for instance, in Alberta, and this comes from various sources of legislation, the environment means, this is a quote, the components of the earth, and includes air, land, and water, all layers of the atmosphere, all organic and inorganic matter, and living organisms, and any interacting natural systems. So that's a pretty enlightened view of it. It's pretty broad, so that's certainly not a bad way to look at it. And of course, remember, in Alberta, the environment is an incredibly important issue, particularly because, of course, the oil sands and the transportation of oil in pipelines. Ontario lists the environment to include plant and animal life. It includes humans and the social, economic, and cultural, and see, Alberta did say nothing about cultural conditions that influence the life of humans or a community. as well as any building, structure, machine, or other device or theme made by humans as components of the environment. Right? And again, of course, because Ontario has a somewhat different, provides a different context for the environment than does other jurisdictions like Alberta, then its laws that it puts in place, relate to this local context compared to other jurisdictions. So, in this part of the lecture, we're going to talk about definition of terms, the application of principles that have been applied in the environment, and evolution of environmental laws in Canada, which was put out in a lot of detail in chapter 1 in your textbook. So pollution is a term that everybody's familiar with. Pollution is pretty much the very first concept or term that anybody paid attention to with respect to the environment. So basically addressing anti-pollution measures are clearly essential to environmental law because it's the very first thing that people actually said, you know what, our water, our lands, our air are being polluted. This is now 50, 60 years ago. We need to do something about it. So it was a recognition finally by governments of the day that something had to be done to protect the environment. What's meant by pollution and what constitutes prohibited levels of pollution, again, varies upon where you are, and it varies internally in various jurisdictions with whatever scientific or professional analysis is provided, right? So again, it's very local and geographically contextual. Also, the argument is made that pollution is a socially defined phenomenon, which is something constructed by enforcement officials. So again, it's constructed by those who make the laws. Right, and again, the laws are constructed by the definitions of the environment that each jurisdiction has. All right, so the next term is conservation. So this is something that came along after a recognition that pollution was an issue, and conservation initially was a term put in place with a social objective to maintain resource stocks and capacity. So this here we're talking about, primarily, for instance, fish stocks, right? Which for those people who live on the ocean, many of them make their living as a function of fishing, and governments have authority over capacity for fishing. They can put caps in place, and they have. The cod fisheries off of Newfoundland were very, very much limited in the last 30, 40 years because the cod was being incredibly depleted, mostly by foreign fisheries. Russian trawlers actually had fish factories on the ocean where they would in fact do a humongous amount of fishing off the Grand Banks in Newfoundland, and they would catch the fish and process them and bring them ready for market right on these ships themselves. And so what the Canadian government did, because they were protecting our fish stocks, is that they put extreme measures in place to limit fishing. And what that did, obviously with the hope of getting the cod to replenish themselves when they weren't being overfished, what it did is it put a lot of people out of work, right? So it was a very controversial thing, and it still is in Newfoundland and Labrador. Conservation went from simply being the protection of stocks of not always fish. It could also mean animals, obviously, and fauna and flora, those kind of things. It's a broader definition now, but it's moved from conserving the amount that exists to looking towards a guide for a sustainable use of resources and the environment going forward. And we're going to talk about sustainability in a few minutes. All right. There's a Supreme Court of Canada's decision. It's Regina and Sundown. Regina means it's a criminal case against a company. And what the court had to say in that case was conservation laws should be construed generously to refer not only to the conservation of game and fish, but also to the environment they inhabit. All right. So this is part of the evolution of conservation. Again, it's gone from protecting the amount of stock of fish and fauna kind of thing and whatever to actually the inhabitant, the lands and the oceans. So that's again how conservation has evolved. Legislation aimed at preserving habitat and biodiversity The water quality, this is again from the Supreme Court, the water quality, groundwater in lakes, rivers, and streams, topsoil conservancy, and the prevention of erosion may be laws in relation to conservation. All right, so this is now the Supreme Court over the course of years itself developing its own context for how they see conservation and how it should be interpreted. All right, the next definition is sustainable development. Right, and then again, this is part of a road going forward. Sustainable development is an approach to decision making that takes a long-term focus and recognizes the interdependence of domestic and global activities. Again, we'll talk a lot more about that next week when it comes to the international context. But now now we're coming into, and we'll talk about this later in the lecture when we talk about the actual stages of evolution of environmental law. We're seeing how it's becoming more enlightened, it's becoming broader, it's becoming something that everybody is now starting to recognize that we should not only be protecting what exists, but we should be making plans to protect what's going to come in the future. Right, and it also, sustainability focuses on the fair distribution of costs and benefits of development between nations of the developed and developing worlds, which is one of the things we just talked about regarding the film. So it's a balance that has to take place. All right, so we're going to watch this TED Talk. It's about 18 minutes or so. Hopefully I can get this ready for you so we can watch it. Hang on a second. One of the things I have to do is make sure yeah, here we go. I'll get this right. All right, guys, let's watch this and then we'll come back to finish the lecture.
This is my granddaughter. Isn't she beautiful? It's just extraordinary, the first look at life and how exciting it could be. Sometimes I look at Josie May and I say, what sort of life is she going to have? Especially when you look forward to about 2050 when she's 43, because by 2050, the world is supposed to get rid of 80% of the CO2 it's generating now to avert climate disaster. If we don't, we're going to have more and more of these terrible things like the disaster in New Orleans there. Now, I was involved in the IPCC in the last few years, helping write this. And I've got to tell you, there aren't many people in that group who could see how we could actually get there. That 80% reduction, that's a big call. And when you look at the curves of gas and coal and oil and the total carbon that's produced, it all looks out of control. It's going up and up and up. How are we going to possibly get rid of 80% of that by 2050? Well, it's even a harder story when you start to see the emerging countries like China, which is now the biggest carbon polluter in the world. What are they going to do? They're not the goodest, it seems, on that. Not so good at this. But you can see how it starts to come in on us. And I don't know if you feel like that some days when you look to the future. I certainly have. And it is quite possibly going to be difficult. But I want to tell you a different story that's emerging, a much more hopeful one. I want to tell you that if you look for hope in this climate change story, there is some amazing stories just beginning to emerge. And I want to let some of that be known. Certainly, over the years, we've found little glimpses of hope in stories like this. We put them in books. And this is Vauban in Freiburg, which is a 5,000 dwellings place where it's carbon-free. And it's a good place to live. It's not as though they're sort of being poor. And the big thing for us is to work out if this is a movement that is changing the world. Are we getting somewhere in the mainstream? They call it the green economy. It's the sixth wave of the future innovation. We've had 5. We're in the digital wave. What's emerging is the green economy. And the big question is, are we getting there quickly enough? And that mainstreaming is what I want to talk to you about, because underneath it is this fundamental question that wealth has always been associated with fossil fuel consumption. They're totally coupled. We have to continue getting wealthier. The world needs to get out of poverty in many places. But we can't do it unless we disassociate ourselves from fossil fuels. CO2's got to go down, GDP up. Now, the green economy has been struggling because those two things are coupled. But you get to a point where it starts to turn over. And then down the other side of that curve, the market is working for you. So it can go very quickly. And they're the trends I want to quickly show you today. The critical point is at that turnover, because the world suddenly begins to look different. So I want to look at coal and oil. If you took King Coal as a lot of the media, it's essentially saying you can't change it. It's just going to be around for a long time. But if you look at banking and their financial interest, where are they investing? Coal and gas are going down as investments for power. Renewables are going up. And about 2008-9, it switched over. So there's now more money going into renewables than into coal and gas for power production. So the bankers of the world have made a decision. And they're saying the fossil fuels are going to phase out. So where are we going to invest? You invest in renewables. At the same time, we're needing less power. In the developed world, the decoupling of wealth from power has happened. In the UK, for example, around 2004, power consumption started going down. We were getting cleverer at running our homes and businesses, better appliances and technologies. So we were beginning to change. The same thing in Australia. 2008, power consumption began going down. The utilities were still planning for it to go up, but it was a bit of a shock to them. And one of the reasons for it is solar. Now, solar is getting cheaper and cheaper. Yesterday, the International Energy Agency came out and said solar is going to be about 4 cents a kilowatt hour, and it will be the most dominant part of power production by 2020. A very rapid change is coming. Now, in Perth, 10% of homes now have solar photovoltaics on their roofs, mostly in the outer suburbs where they've got bigger roofs, and more need, because the homes were built pretty poorly and, they take a lot of power. But that's 310 megawatts. That's a substantial power station distributed amongst the city, and it's growing very quickly, much quicker than most people thought. Now, Josh's house. Josh Byrne is one of our staff members in CUSP, and one of the 100 or so researchers we've got who are looking to the future to create a more hopeful potential by 2050. His house, it's an ordinary house in Hilton. He's designed and built. You've seen maybe it on TV, but he's totally wired up this family house in order to check how well it's doing. It's a passive solar design. It's got no aircon. You can see the PVs on the roof there. The first data has come in now to show that the amount of electricity that Josh's house uses is tiny, just a few percent compared to a Perth average household. And most of that is in the evening when it's more expensive. So when you get the green area there that's produced from the PVs on the roof, you see that it not only neutralises that amount of carbon that is consumed, but it creates more renewables back into the grid. So it's actually carbon positive. Now that's a fantastic story, because essentially there's greater wealth there. It's a much better place to live, but no carbon. Now, I'm not a great car salesman, but this is a Tesla. This is an electric vehicle, and they're starting now to take off around the world. But the important thing for this story about coal is the batteries that are being developed for these electric vehicles are now taking off and being used as storage in homes. So you can have your PV cells and a battery and an electric vehicle, and you're basically self-sufficient. Now, you will be part of a grid, but it'll be the primary source of your power, and you will not need to depend on coal or oil, come to that. So what about China? Isn't China building a coal-fired power station every week? No. They stopped. In fact, they should get into that good guide, because they are demonstrating how to decouple. You see GDP there splitting off from coal. Coal consumption has peaked in China. That's very recent data. You've seen it first on TEDx Perth. So coal and gas are coming down in their investments, in their power consumption. Renewables dramatically going up. It's a big story. So coal is in decline, and global divestment is now happening. The World Bank, the EU and the US government have all banned any further coal-fired power stations. And the institutions like universities, superannuation, foundations, churches are also divesting, because they can see you can actually make money for your shareholders, but you don't need carbon. That's a new world that's coming very quickly. Now, what about oil? Oil's slightly different because it's running out anyway. Essentially, peak oil has happened. Peak oil as in conventional oil, which is cheap. 2006. The oil we're now using, as there's a bit of growth happening in the world, is coming from expensive sources like fracking, like deep water in the oceans, tar sands. They're very expensive. So the price is going up, is staying up, and it's unlikely that we'll ever have cheap oil again. It's really pricing itself out of the future. Now, the response has been around the world, we're beginning to see cities, in fact whole nations now, driving less. You see here the US. They're back to levels of car use that they had in 1994. It's peaked. It's going down after 100 years of growing consistently. Now, the peak occurred around about the time the price of oil reached $80 a barrel, and it's well over that now. The same thing's happened in Australia. In every Australian city, you can see there the big cities and the small cities. Canberra's on the top there. They drive cars like fury there. And but it started to peak as well. And Perth, along with Hobart and Darwin, they were all peaked. So something's going on. And that happened in 2004, the same year. Certainly the price of oil is one thing, but culture is changing, especially amongst the young. You see the red lines here are the most recent driving. So in the teens, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, 50s even, people are driving less. Go on into the 60s, to us baby boomers, we're driving more. We grew up with the car. Give us a break, you know, I mean, and we're going to drive to our own funerals, which are happening quite frequently. So the change is on. We're essentially moving away from the car. That's a big change. It's happened without people really noticing it. Why is it happening? Certainly the use of social media devices is universal now, and you can use them a lot better in a bus or a train than you can in a car. So there's no doubt that you can see a growth in public transport in the decade since these social media devices have taken off. So in all the cities of the world, public transport is booming. I spent 30 years trying desperately to hang on to a good rail system here in Perth. Now you can't hardly get into it at peak times. It is not a question of popularity anymore. It is really just a question of how quickly we can build more. What about China? Well, they've also decoupled from oil. The wealth is growing and they're cutting back on oil. How is this happening? There are three things happening, but they're all about electric transport. For a start, they've built amazing metro systems in their cities. 86 metros have been built. And it really began a short time ago, certainly this century, but in the last 5 years, dramatic growth in the number of metros. At the same time, electric vehicles, especially the cheaper version, which are electric bikes and electric scooters, there's 250 million of them, using renewable fuel, if you've got enough renewables there, rather than oil. And high-speed rail. In 7 years, they've built over 8,500 kilometres of high-speed rail. Now, you saw Utopia talk about the high-speed rail fiasco, and, I've been a supporter of that, and it was embarrassing to watch, but we need it. And at some point in our future, we're going to do it. They did it in China, very dramatically. You can go to any big city now and go to the railway station for the high-speed train. It's like a massive airport, incredibly popular. Just a quick look at Shanghai. Look at the difference between 1990 and 2010. Dramatic. And they started by building highways, flirting with the American model. But it kind of didn't work. Dense cities in Asia don't really take too many cars. And what do you do when you get to that stage? You build a metro. So Shanghai built the biggest metro in the world in 10 years. There are 8 million people a day using that metro. It's an extraordinary story. It's pretty good, I think. Now, Beijing, similarly, and they don't like to be beaten by Shanghai, they've now got 9 million passengers a day on their metro. You can see in the green line the dramatic decline of the bicycle. And at the same time, the private vehicle's growing and replacing it. But that stopped. The private vehicle has peaked. The big growth now is in that public transport, and that's the metro. And that's continuing to grow dramatically. So we do see decoupling of wealth and fossil fuels, of GDP and CO2. We've seen the market struggle, and we can now see the green economy starting to thrive. The peak, I think we're at that point now. What it means is that there are very different futures that begin to emerge on the other side of that peak. It's like we've been climbing a mountain and we couldn't see properly. You get to the top and it looks very different. Let me just show you. Before the peak, this is the kind of thing that you saw. It was now is just a continuation of what was there. And they're all going up. And that's not very helpful. But after the peak, you can see that each of these fossil fuels reaches a point where it begins to decline, and renewables keeps going up. GDP keeps going up, but CO2 is going down. And you can actually begin to imagine 80% less CO2 by 2050. Now that's a huge relief, but it doesn't mean it's going to happen just like that. But we can begin to see it. We can still mess things up. We're going to need every ripple and wave possible to keep things going. Lots of heroes are needed. This is Ephesus. In 1000 AD, it was abandoned. It was a city that knew what was going wrong because their port, which is at the end of that street there, was silting up. And it was being caused by cutting all the trees in the forests around on the hills. And they kept doing it. Eventually, the city was closed down because the port, the ocean entry to the river is about 12 kilometres away now. So you can mess it up. But we can now see over the mountain. We can begin to see a possible better future. For Josie May, my granddaughter, I can at least imagine a world that is better for her and one where we have coped with this massive change. Let's hope so. Thank you.
All right, guys, there we go. Before we go continue the lecture, anybody have any comments on what they saw in that TED Talk? No? Okay. All right, so let's keep going forward. So biodiversity, all right, which is the we just dealt with originally pollution and then conservation and sustainability, now biodiversity, all right? So again, this is an evolution. So biodiversity is an ecosystem, a dynamic complex of plant, animal, and microorganism communities and their non-living environment interacting as a functional unit, right? So that's obviously an enlightened position, right? And as a function of that, if one part is harmed, the entire ecosystem may be affected. And obviously, when governments pass laws dealing with the environment and they keep this in mind, they have to know that by controlling one part of things that may well harm the environment, they can hopefully protect something that is, related, but down the line and not necessarily visible in that particular sphere. The concept of biological diversity gives prominence to the importance of the variety in terms of life on Earth to include species to species diversity and genetic diversity. And we're going to talk more about all of these things in future classes. Okay, now we're going to talk about some principles that have been in play in the last 50 years in the environmental movement. So the first one, and this again dealt with pollution to begin with, it was called the polluter pays principle, which is very simple. It simply meant that governments, when they looked at pollution, basically took the position that the polluter, those who in fact caused the pollution, will be responsible for all the costs associated in cleaning up that pollution. Right? That's a pretty easy concept to understand. So those who engage in pollution, harmful conduct, are the ones that are responsible for those costs. The Supreme Court in decision Imperial Oil in Quebec said this, that the polluter paid principle was to encourage sustainable development. That principle assigns polluters the responsibility for remedying contamination for which they are responsible and imposes on them direct and immediate costs of pollution. All right, so that's a very basic concept. However, in real terms, notwithstanding the fact that it was recognized by the Supreme Court in the Imperial decision, courts who have basically been put in the position where they have to adjudicate governments who try to impose the polluter pay principle on those who cause pollution, they haven't necessarily been on board with putting it into practice, right? And that's something that the jurisprudence has shown over time. So courts have been, in fact, reluctant to apply the polluter pay principle, all right? The next principle is called the precautionary principle. So this is moving beyond simply identifying who causes harm to the environment and ostensibly making them pay for it. The precautionary principle is a principle that basically says that early preventive action is appropriate even in the absence of a scientifically documented need. So think about that. That's a very forward-looking kind of principle. What it's basically saying is that somehow, and yes, that somehow is a big question, but somehow, even when it's not necessarily seen in a particular situation that the environment may be harmed, if there is in some way or another some way to gauge that in fact that may well take place in the future, even if it's not yet scientifically proven, then there needs to be some precautionary action taken to ensure that doesn't take place, right? So where there are, again, threats of serious or irreversible damage, the lack, this is the principle, the lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation, right? So that's a very enlightened approach, but one that is a bit of a scattershot kind of approach, in that, you know, if you want to be, you know, particularly careful about any possible harms to the environment going forward, you put in place provisions, legislation, regulations that affects everything. So it can be, in fact, a onerous kind of principle to put into place. Pollution prevention, back up a bit, is environmental protection to reduce or avoid the creation of environmental contaminants in the first instance, rather than trying to control and contain the impact later, right? So that's the first principle. And both of these have evolved into what's called adaptive management principles, which is the process of continuous learning, all right? So we're not just taking a void and putting something into place to fill that void with the intent of protecting the environment in the future. We're actually, you know, basically incorporating what we're learning and how that evolves, it's you know, we basically continue that learning, but we accept that there is an uncertainty in what may well happen in the future. And what it is basically, it is a response to both the pollution principle and the precautionary principle. It basically is a response to the difficulty in trying to predict all the environmental consequences of a project on the basis of what you know now versus what you may well know in the future. All right, and so what it in fact does is it counters the potential paralyzing effect of the precautionary principle, which, if you take it to its nth degree, would stop all development of all kinds, because there is very little that is done to the earth, to the oceans, to woods, to mountains, whatever you're talking about. There's very little that development that will take place in any of those physical environments that won't potentially cause environmental harm in a biodiversical kind of way. So, you know, the adaptive principle basically backs off from stopping all development, but tries to basically be careful about development going forward. And again, we'll talk much more about that in following classes. All right, so the last part of tonight's lecture deals with the evolutionary phases in Canadian environmental law. So this comes from chapter 1 in your textbook. So the first phase, and again, you know, this is when I was a kid, you know, it deals with the 1960s and dealing with pollution, right? Because again, that was the first thing that came to the attention of governments and the population, really. And at that time, you know, there wasn't anything innovative to look at with respect to how to address problems that pollution was giving rise to and contamination. So what really was used were the existing tools that we had in our legal toolbox. And again, if you've had the constitutional classes with me before on how laws come to be and how our laws have evolved in Canada, or if you've looked at chapter 2 on Moodle, you know, before tonight's class, you'll know that, you know, that Canada has a common law system. You know, it's a system where, except for Quebec, which is a civil law system, but the common law system, which obviously is predominant in Canada, is what we know as, you know, basically, you know, is the system that we use to solve our legal problems, and punishing people for harming the environment becomes a legal problem, right? So in the early 60s, we used common law rights and early statutes. So basically, we did have, you know, both the government in Ottawa, which is the federal government, can pass statutes, and the governments in each of the provinces and territories can pass statutes and regulations to deal with issues. So that started to happen in the early 1960s. So it was the first time that the environment was given any real serious attention. So it said the main tools of environmental law were causes of action under tort, right? Tort, and I'd ask you to put up your hands about who knows what a tort is. A lot of you do. Tort is a wrong. If somebody has done something wrong to somebody else that isn't criminal in nature, in the civil context, it is a tort. Or it can be directly an issue of property law, which includes things like the law of nuisance, which is when you basically interfere with somebody else's enjoyment of their property, and the law of negligence, which is where you basically, not on purpose, but erroneously and carelessly have something happen that again causes harm to somebody else. So in the early days of Canadian law dealing with the environment, all we really basically had were lawsuits in property law, torts, and negligence to basically bring claims against those people who were causing harm. So that's the government would sue polluters kind of thing, or people who individually thought they were being harmed could likewise bring these kind of lawsuits. So that's how environmental law started in Canada, basically. The kind of statutes that were initially looked at were things like, again, the Federal Fisheries Act. So remember, the conservation of fish stocks, and I talked about the Grand Banks, Newfoundland. That was one of the very first instances where government thought that they had to do something to protect the preservation of a species, fish, the codfish. So the Federal Fisheries Act was the statute in place to do that. And again, it's a federal statute because dealing with oceans is a federal responsibility under Section 91 of the Constitution. So again, that's on that lecture that's on Moodle that is there for you. Public health statutes could be passed. You did have the access to the criminal codes, criminal sanctions for things like public nuisance that wasn't simply a civil matter, but rose to the level of being a crime, right? Although it's a relatively low-level crime, but it was certainly there. We had anti-pollution provisions in statutes dealing with natural resources. And we also had citizens who started to give rise to movements to basically try to get things done. And remember, the 1960s was an incredibly active decade. The civil rights movement took place in the 1960s. The movement to end the Vietnam War took place in the 1960s. It was a very, very dynamic decade. Where basically the citizens of countries, mostly the United States and some in Canada, other Western nations, the citizenry came together to get things done that they thought weren't being done appropriately by the various levels of government. Okay, the second phase, the late 1960s, basically, here it was realized that just using the common law and a little bit of the criminal code really wasn't a particularly effective or comprehensive way to deal with the environment. So it was realized that comprehensive environmental protection was needed. Things like cleanup laws, regulating the discharge of waste. And this is something that was relatively new because the discharge of waste, it became to be something that people actually paid attention to. So I can tell you, for instance, and it's probably still the case, that in Sault Ste. Marie, for instance, everybody who flushes a toilet or discharges waste from their house, for instance, it goes into a waste dispensing facility and probably dispenses it into the St. Mary's River. The City of Toronto discharges the waste from the 3 or 4 million people that live in the GTA into Lake Ontario, right? And the thought is that, and the thought has always been that the waste would decompose and certainly broke up to a great degree and was dispersed in these large bodies of water. And that's just not indicative of Sault Ste. Marie or Toronto. It's pretty much the way that waste was dealt with in every major or small city around the world that had access to bodies of water. And so, again, this is in the late 60s where people started to say, hey, you know what? That's not necessarily a good thing. And what's happened is that instead of a direct discharge into, for instance, the Lake Ontario for Toronto, or for instance, St. Mary's River in the Sioux, what the waste pollution plants grew up, and what they would do is ostensibly at least filter the waste before it was discharged into these bodies of water, right? And they had different levels of efficiency for how these plants were involved. And that was all a function of these cleanup laws coming into effect in the late 60s. So now there's been over 60 years of awareness of how to do that. So there aren't any, for instance, waste plants that are built these days that aren't of the tertiary level, the third level, where in fact the waste that comes into the plants is almost totally distilled into clean water going into the bodies of water. That's how effective and efficient they are these days. And as a function of that, a belief grew that the environment, and keep this in mind, this is early days, it was believed that the environment still could be used for disposal, right? And pay attention to the film you just saw. So as long as there was not too much contamination at any one time and place. Right? And you hear that today, and that's totally unacceptable in today's standards. But 60 years ago, this was the first position that governments, for the most part, took. That we'll control some of this waste, but some of it is allowable, so long as it's not, way too much, whatever that level of way too much would have been. All right. Phase 3. Now we're moving forward to the 1970s and the 1980s. Right, so here now obviously it's an evolution. So it was understanding that waste control and cleanup laws didn't consider accumulation, specifically persistent toxic substances. Again, the awareness of plastics is really only a phenomenon we've got to know in the last 10 or 20 years with the absolute proliferation of plastics. But there's all kinds of other things that would be discharged as waste that would have toxic inherent toxicity to them, and that the laws that were put in place for the cleanup that said, yeah, some waste is okay as long as it's not too much. That was very basic, and that 10 years going on, it was thought, well, you know what, maybe this waste, we have to look at the quality of the waste, just not the quantity, right? Most toxic control laws are federal. Although some are provincial, they're federal because, again, the federal responsibility under 91 of the Constitution deals with the dispersal of waste that clearly goes into oceans and crosses boundaries. So if anything crosses a provincial boundary, then it becomes a matter within federal jurisdiction. And there's because the Great Lakes and all kinds of waterways, the St. Lawrence Seaway, all those kind of things, they pass through provincial boundaries. So most toxic control laws are of a federal nature. In phase 3, the case, this is in your textbook, Regina and Hydro-Quebec and the Environmental Containments Act, again dealt with toxic control bylaws, basically, and it recognized, again, in a kind of a very slow-moving way, that environmental protection is a long-term process. So in the 70s, 80s, they recognized that it wasn't possible to flick a switch overnight and have whatever they were doing to prevent pollution, contamination, toxicity on land and in water. It couldn't be cleaned up overnight. So it's going to be a longer term process. And you got to remember that they recognize that these things cost money, and it costs, and how do governments raise money? By way of taxes. So, they had to be very cognizant of the fact that this thing called the environment, which was gaining importance in the public eye from the 60s going forward, they had to basically balance the cost of taking care of the environment with other offsetting things in the economy. And so, for instance, they wouldn't necessarily cripple business, generating jobs for people and income in the economy. They wouldn't jeopardize those kind of things totally for the sake of saving the environment, basically. but they did recognize that toxic substances don't respect ecosystems or political boundaries. And again, that's why the federal government has such a large role to play in this kind of thing. And lastly, we have the phase 4. Phase 4 is what we're in now. So from the 90s going forward, which is basically comprehensive approaches to environmental assessment and planning. And we'll have separate classes in the next few weeks, totally dealing with environmental assessments, regulatory regimes, how things are put in place, which anticipate and try to prevent environmental harms, basically. So environmental assessments are incredibly important, and again, we'll talk about this in a lot more detail. But resource companies that plan to do things, that obviously are going to involve the environment. They're resource companies. They almost always have to do environmental assessments. They basically have experts hired who will, provide an assessment to the government before they're given, for instance, a license to carry on whatever resource extraction business they want to, right? And this also includes, in different levels of government, provincial and municipal. Municipal governments pass bylaws to get things done. And so one of the things that the city of Sault Ste. Marie has is a planning department. So if you want to do something within the boundaries of Sault Ste. Marie to get a license to build something, right? You get a license from the building department. Chances are highly likely that you're going to have to also, before that license or the permit to build becomes available, you're going to have to pass whatever tests been put in place under the Planning Act, which is provincial legislation, but regulated by the municipalities. And again, we'll talk more about that in the future. And lastly, these 4 associated trends in environmental law, which is going to be, the topic of our classes going forward, are the regional, the continental, which is obviously continents like North America, South America, global, across the world effects, transparency, and citizen participation. And we've touched upon that, how that was given rise in the 60s. International influences, and here we're going to talk about things like the Kyoto Accord and the Treaty of Paris, these kind of things where nations come together and sign on to, for instance, limits on what level of air pollution or whatever it may well be, they're going to find as acceptable 20, 30 years into the future, basically. And we're going to talk about the effective and efficient application of the law, which obviously is the centerpiece of the course. Okay, so that brings us to the next part of the class, and what it's going to be is essentially what are called breakout rooms. So one of the other things you would have seen on Moodle is I've put there on Moodle a breakout sessions. Now I'm going to, for the first time we do this, I have a question from Joy about forming the groups yourselves. So no, we're not going to do that tonight. I'm going to use the tool that Zoom gives me for the breakout rooms to assign you randomly into groups. So there's going to be 6 groups. There are 6 questions on Moodle that are from chapters 1 and 2, and obviously for tonight's readings. So we're kind of flying by the seat of our pants here tonight about how this is going to work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break you out into these breakout rooms. So we have 25 participants, students in the class. I'm going to put you into 6 rooms. I'm going to do that so that there's going to be 4 to 5 in each room. And so if you're in room number 1, I want you to address question number 1 that I posted on Moodle. So for instance, if you're room number 1, your question is, the court's role in the development of Canadian environmental law appears to be minor relative to that of the players. Is this correct? And explain. Okay, so these questions I'll always post for you at least the day before the class that they're going to be discussed. And I'm going to do this as a regular feature. So this constitutes our in-class exercises on your grading categories, and it's worth 20% of your overall grade. So I'll be grading everybody in the responses. So the whole idea is you break out into your room, you answer the question that your room number corresponds with. I'm gonna say that we're gonna do it for I'll give you 15 minutes to put the answer to the question together, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about, was that enough time or was it more than enough time? because we'll try to, these questions are going to be kind of similar every class that we do this in. So I'm going to, the groups will, you will know on your screen what group you're into. So I'll create the rooms now, right? Okay, so everybody, I've got everybody in these rooms. I'm going to open the rooms now. Let's put you into them. Again, if you're breakout room number 1, you go to question 1, breakout room number 2, question 2, all the way to number 6. There's 6 groups, okay? Fundamentally 4 of you in each group, except one group has 5. I'll give you 15 minutes for it, and then we'll come back, and then I'll ask each group or a representative from each group to present your answer. All right, so let's give this a try. This is the first time I've ever done this, so hopefully it works, and it's something that we can use in future classes. Okay, so there you go. You're all in rooms. Hi, Olivia.
Hi, I got kicked off my internet. Is there any way you could put me in a group?
I tried to do that. It's now the last minute of the group, so don't worry about it. I won't count it against you, but we'll figure this out in the future.
Thank you.
No
So should
problem.
I just wait then?
Right, yeah, just hang in there.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Oh.
All right, guys, you should all be back in the class. All right, just a couple of things. So one student was her internet went down, so she got kicked out of the of her group, and it was too late to put her back into another group when she got back on. But that's, you know, if that ever happens, you know, basically ask to be admitted back into the class as soon as you can, and I can get you into a group. I have that capacity. There's in group 5, there's a name called Acer, A-C-E-R. Who is that? I don't have that in my, what's that full name? Who is in group 5? Who's Acer?
That's Pete.
What is it?
Pete. Pete.
Oh, you mean
Pikachu.
Pete? Pete came, well, no, Pete came in really late. That wouldn't be Pete.
He's on his video right now. I can see him.
Okay, well, I'll ask. I mean, I know Pete. He doesn't. I've never heard him refer to himself that way. But nobody else was in group 5 that apart from Pete. Okay, so I'll talk to Pete about that. He came in late. All right, 15 minutes. Was that okay for everybody? Should it be shorter or longer?
Longer, sir, please.
Longer. Okay, so
we'll give you our answer and you tell us.
That's a good one.
I would prefer longer.
Okay, that's fine, guys. That's cool. So what are you thinking? 20, 25 minutes? You tell me. The questions will pretty much be the same caliber whenever we do this, which should be pretty regular.
Well, the questions are at the end of the chapter too, so we.
That's right. So you know what? And you always know what they're going to be. There's more questions than I actually post. But yeah, so, and again, I post the questions on Moodle at least the day before the class. So you don't know necessarily which group you're going to be in, but you can know what the questions are. But it's that's the caliber of questions you had tonight are the same caliber we'll have for all the chapters. So what do people think? 20 minutes, 25 minutes?
Somewhere in that range. It's nice to be able to expand in the group on various ideas that come up.
Okay, Michael. All right, so let's tell you what. I'll do 20 minutes next time, and then before it ends, though, I'll broadcast a message asking if you need more time, and use the chat function to tell me yes or no. All right, so I don't want you guys to feel like you're under a lot of. The idea isn't to put you under pressure to answer these questions. All right, so let's go through them. So there was essentially four 4 people in each group. So I'll just go through them in the order that you did them. So the first group, and I know who's in each group, so I've recorded that, so don't worry about me giving you the credit for being in the group. So the first question, so this is the breakout group number 1. The court's role in the development of Canadian environmental law appears to be minor relative to that of other players. Is that correct, and explain? So somebody from that group, take it away, please.
Hi. Yes, we agreed that the
Tyler?
courts
Tyler,
are
your internet.
not
Tyler?
specific enough in their actions and yeah.
Yeah, there's a problem with
Yeah, I can hear you.
I'm gonna need somebody else in group.
Here, I can take over.
Okay,
So,
thank you. Okay.
what I was sort of thinking was in retrospect to what all the sort of other government systems did in sort of reforming the environmental laws. I would agree with the fact that the courts had maybe like a lesser so role in the factor, but however, I do think that in the phase 1 sort of stage, the fact that the courts wouldn't recognize the right of citizens to challenge the government statutes kind of forced lawyers who are environmentally conscious and, et cetera, to find these loopholes with like torts and sort of like cases, the action of nuisance and negligence, which I think then sort of, kind of transgressed into sort of the other phases that we have heard about today. So I do agree with the sense that maybe in relation to all the other government systems involved, they probably had a lesser involvement, but I do think that they were sort of a Kickstarter or fire starter in kind of lighting the fire for other people to want to maybe get involved or like try and find those loopholes until it then became actual law or yeah.
All right, Joy. So is your answer then that the players for environmental law were of minor nature compared to other ones, or in fact you think that's not correct?
Sorry, repeat the question. Sorry.
Yeah, the question was, I mean, that in the development of Canadian environmental law, the players in that development of the law were minor relative to players in other areas of the law, for instance. Is that so? Is your answer yes or no?
So I'm saying I was saying yes, that the court's role in the development seems to be minor in relative to that of other players. However, I was just expressing the fact that I do think they were important in sort of getting it started in a way. They were sort of an important factor in as I said, sort of lighting the fire and getting people to try and think of loopholes, which then created change. But then I believe that the actual government and provincial systems that did actually create the laws and the change do require more credit. So therefore, I do think that they had less of a role than other systems.
Super, great, thank you. Okay, the second group, the question was, what accounts for the exceptionally broad scope of Canadian environmental law?
So basically, as you said before, environment, like the word environment is a very contextual term. So like, it is very multifaceted in a sense. You have to look at it from many angles. So there's a lot of things to address in the environment, which I think contribute to why it is it's a broad topic in Canada and why there's many laws. Because first we describe phase 1 where we address the whole Federal Fishery Act. Then we talk about the public health statutes, the criminal code with public nuisance. Then phase 2 basically talk about waste control and cleanup. Phase 3 talk about toxic control law. So basically, the law basically can address everything at once. So like over time, it has to expand because the laws that we used to govern like the 1960s aren't the same laws that we're going to use to govern 2020. So like over time, they have to tackle different issues in the environment, because the environment is big. There's many things to address. Also, my group members, would you want to take away the second point? Anyone? Or I
Well,
should
I
go?
think that the reason why the scope in Canada is so wide is because there's so many jurisdictions. There's federal, provincial, there's indigenous, there's also environmental regulatory law, which it's the government discharges harmful substances that go into the water and the air. And then there's environmental assessment law, which requires the study of attention to environmental considerations in the planning and approval of new undertakings. And it's also the core of environmental law. So both of these together are vast, and it's society that predicts what the government's going to decide what is harmful and what's not harmful.
Super. Good answer, guys. Thank you very much. Yep. So that's certainly broad, and that's exactly what I asked for. Group 3, what factors have pushed environmental law to be more ambitious, and what factors have limited its expansion and effectiveness? Do you have a spokesperson for Group 3?
Yeah, I think we have two persons. I'm going to speak on the limitations, and my group member going to speak to the other half of the question.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for the factors that pushed environmental law to be more ambitious, it was human activism that really pushed it. And if Orette wants to continue for the second part.
Well, what we came up with as relates to limitations, particularly in Canada, is the disagreement between the federal government and the provincial government as relates to what goals are attainable, our way forward. There seems to be a great disconnect between federal and province, and it varies between different provinces as relates to what goals are attainable and how we move forward with that. And I think the lack of support leads to the inability to pass legislation that will hasten the process or help to protect the environment too. Another far stretch to that is also interest groups that are also supporting the government decision to move slow or not act, particularly mining companies, lumbering companies who have a great stake in the environment and how they profit from that. All those things affect and sways our elected officials' decision as to how to proceed. And perhaps us as well, as she mentioned, activism. There's also persons in our society who doesn't really want the change, they see it as being inconvenient. So we are sort of enjoying the convenience that our current lifestyle gives us and not wanting to give up something now to save us down the road. I think all these factors limits expansion of environmental laws being enacted. That's it, sir.
Very good. Thanks, Ariana. Thank you very much. All right, guys, the fourth one from your reading of chapter 1, would you conclude that Canadian environmental law has been successful in protecting and improving the environment? So somebody from number 4.
Okay, so basically, according to chapter 1, we're not doing well when we compare ourselves to other countries when it comes to controlling releases of the toxic substances. But that doesn't mean we haven't made any attempts. Certain industrial chemicals are still releasing soaring levels of substances that are hazardous to our environment, and they have been emitting these substances since 2006. But we have made a lot of good changes to our environment too. We've invested heavily financially into protecting our environment. But so I do believe that according to chapter 1, we have been improving the environment, but I don't believe it's fast enough and as effective as some other countries are doing.
Okay, good, Sarah. Thank you. I mean, that's a great question to lead off the rest of the classes this semester. So that's really appropriate. Okay, so the last two questions dealt with Chapter 2, the Constitution. So, either you've had this with me before, or you would have needed to read the chapter and hopefully watch the presentation on Moodle. So question number 5 is a very broad question. What is the role of the Constitution and environmental?
So what we came up together is it's the government's right to exercise authority over the nation, people, and institutions. So the responsible government versus the representative government is divided between the federal and provincial governments. Relates back to fisheries, shipping, interprovincial trade, so the railroad being made back in the day. So the provinces were joined, and the criminal code is in that as well. The Canada's constitution is rather silent on the environmental protection, but there are 5 provinces that are being recognized and want a healthier environment. Ontario enacted an Environmental Bill of Rights in 1993. It also states that parts of the Constitution is working on a stronger law and environmental rights to enhance public awareness, but this is all based around the House of Commons and who are elected. So whoever the Prime Minister is, whoever the province is elected, all have an effect on this. That's
Good.
what we got.
Is that it? Good.
Yeah.
All right, guys, and our last question. So this is the breakout session group number 6. Provide examples of federal jurisdiction over environmental matters. Provide examples of provincial jurisdiction over environmental matters.
Hi. So the powers in the Constitution, 1867, that are relevant to environmental law and policy are divided as indicated. Specific provincial powers, section 92 and 109. The specific areas where the province can make laws are, for example, section 92.5, management and sale of public lands, section 92.13, property and civil rights. They also deal with natural resources. Section 92A and the 1982 Resource and Amendment captures change in powers to manage and to capture revenues from non-renewable and forestry resources and generations of electrical energy. They also deal with property issues in section 109. The federal powers are in section 91, and the specific areas where the federal government can make laws are trade and commerce, taxation power, sea, coast and fisheries, indigenous interests and criminal law. They also deal in general power and treaty making power.
Okay, good. Thanks, Kate. All right, guys, super. That was it's really good. So that's pretty much the end of tonight. So I'm hoping that I've given you a pretty good idea of how our classes are going to be conducted. So tonight is probably even a little bit longer than we'll usually go. I certainly don't intend to keep you for 2.5, 3 hours in a summer course. It's just not what I do. And tonight's a little bit long because the first half hour we spent on everybody talking about their film study, which was great. But obviously there's not that kind of assignment every class. So you can expect the classes to be between 1.5 hours and 2 hours long, but the format is pretty similar. I'm always going to try to engage you as much as possible, and you guys have been fabulous. You guys have been better than I ever would have expected in this. So so far, I'm a fan of online classes so far. Although as I said last day, I certainly prefer to be in front of you to see you face to face. But even wonderful. Nobody has shied away from expressing their opinions and we're answering questions. So good on you. So I'll try to engage you as much as possible. Whatever materials I'm going to lecture about, I'm not going to be a talking head to a great degree. So I will, on a pretty consistent basis, prepare an asynchronous lecture that I will post on Moodle, and I'll give you lots of notice about it. So you can watch that at your leisure, and then I'll pick whatever part of the text materials and the PowerPoints I'm going to deal with to do it face to face. I'll pick and obviously conduct the lecture that way. And then we'll do the breakout sections as a regular feature because it seems to work pretty well. Again, next time we do this, we'll deal with, I'll give you more time for it. I don't want you to be rushed, but your answers were great. You did exactly what I was looking for. And it's a really good way for you to get to know each other and to make yourself familiar with the content. And that's obviously the purpose. All right, so are there any questions whatsoever, guys? Again, what will happen is I'm going to, this is being recorded, so I'm going to post this on Moodle, for later reference. If you want to do that, there's a couple of people who could make the class, so they can watch it. I will send you out a quick email for participation, just confirming that you're in the class and that you contributed to the class, which obviously gives you extra marks because you start with an 8 out of 10 to begin with by simply being here. So I'll send that out to everybody. And then, we'll get ready for the next class. The next class on Tuesday is environmental law and indigenous issues, and the class on Thursday is international law. So we're getting into the meat of the substantive law that has been set up this week with the overview. Anybody have any questions before we say goodnight? We good? All right, guys, listen, thank you very much. I appreciate your effort. It's been just great. And I'll see you on Tuesday. Have a good weekend.
You too.
Thank you.